All right, welcome everybody. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
You can just type yes in the chat box there. I'm going to be putting it on listen only shortly in case we have a lot of people coming in later. I'm going to do a very quick overview and introduction, and then we have two presenters today. The first one is Roller from the Community Support Team, and he's going to talk to us about accessing the data on the GLOBE website. And the second one is Jackie Wilson, and she's from Hubbard Brook Research Foundation, and she's going to talk to us about the different types of graphs and other visualizations. All right, so welcome everybody. As you may have remembered, this is our third in the series of a personal development webinar series for GLOBE teachers.
The conference is now in listen-only mode.
And the other ones took place earlier. We had November 5th was one on conducting field investigations. On November 19th, we had the Regional Science Fairs question and answer. On December 9th, we had one on writing research questions. And then we had one from the GLOBE Implementation Office that was on the International Virtual Science Fair, the rubrics and the resources. Today we have analyzing data. And on January 20th coming up, that should be the 27th, is writing conclusions using the CER, the Claims Evidence Reasoning Framework. And then in February we'll have one on putting it all together in communication. We are doing these professional development sessions in support of the Regional Science Fairs for the United States. In each of these we're highlighting the assessment piece that comes straight from the rubric for the International Virtual Science Fair, which is also the same rubric that we're using for the Regional Science Fairs. All of the resources all of the materials, the resources, everything is being published to the GLOBE website. And what we have not been able to do is find some great teacher volunteers, although they wouldn't be strictly volunteers, they would be paid a stipend, so it wouldn't actually be volunteering, but we need teachers to blog about their experience with these different topics and how it's implemented in the classroom. And so we're still looking for that. So if you know any teachers who have been doing this work, so for instance, integrating field investigations, or they really worked on, or if you are a teacher and you're really working on writing good research questions, we'd like to hear about your experience, and we'd like to have you write a blog about it so that other teachers can follow your example, or perhaps look at the challenges you had and try and anticipate those. The United States Regional Science Fairs are taking place this spring. It was funded by a grant through the National Science Foundation. I just found out that the Pacific one is not on here as a solid date, but we know now that it will be April 29th and the 30th, and it will be held at the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California. The other ones here are listed, and where those will be, the first one is at NASA Goddard in Maryland, and that is March 10th and 11th. The U.S. Partner Forum, it breaks up the U.S. into these different geographic areas. And so if you wanted to know where your science fair is going to be, here is the list. So I'm going to start off with, maybe we can handle, Tracy, technical glitch. While you are going to fill out this survey, what is your role in Globe, just so that we can get an idea of what you are doing with Globe. So if everyone wants to put in what they do. So it looks like we mostly have some informal educators here. And what grade bands do you normally work with is the next question. And that can be the teachers that you work with, or if you are a teacher, to put in that. So you have a number of people that work with 9 through 12. And are you currently using Globe in your classroom? And most people seem to be. And then this is just to indicate maybe your area of interest or what you have been working on. So a number of you have been doing atmosphere and hydrosphere. So now that we know those areas of interest, the next thing that I'd like to do is just to review very briefly what we've been doing up until this point. So we have been looking at investigation questions, and one of the things that Pat Otto did was she went through the different types of investigation questions that she uses in her field investigations. And these were descriptive, comparative, and correlative. And then Kevin Chakowski came and did a webinar on developing a doable question, and really pointed out that most questions that students work on are too hard for them to really solve or answer during a small time period. And so it's more about these smaller questions. And finally, they should pick something that they really want to answer. And that leads us into, now that we've gone outside and we've done some field investigations, we've come up with good research questions, and we've collected data using the Globe protocols, the next step then is to retrieve our data from the database, and then also the next step would be, what do we do with it and how do we look at it? And that is where we are today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Roller, who is a member of our community support team at the Globe Implementation Office, who is extremely helpful and knowledgeable on all things website. And so I've unmuted him, and he will be able to take over from there. So thank you, Roller.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Anytime you guys need any questions answered, you can just visit the Globe website, and down here at the bottom when you hit Contact Globe, we have a 1-800 number, as well as our help@globe.gov email. So when you're on the Globe homepage, you can go to Globe Data and then go to Retrieve Data. And this is our new advanced data access tool that lets you find and retrieve Globe data using very specific filters, and then it gives you a CSV file that you can use in an external program. So when you click the big blue button to enter the tool, you're brought to the instructions page. So first thing we're going to do is just choose a school that has some good data in it. So CEG1. And then you just start typing and it'll automatically search the school name for you. So just click the name of the school and add it to the filter. And you'll notice that even though it's checked, it's gray up here. It's because you need to select some filters. So in the data filters, we can do date range, count range, but let's start with some protocols. So you can do air temperature, surface temperature, add protocols. And now you can see there's 1,900 measurements. So let's download those. And then once it's done, you'll see this download link, and you can just click that, and it gives you the zip file. So once you've unzipped it, you have a CSV. And what I use to view my data is just Google. If you drag and drop it into Google Drive, you can open it up. And there's a button in Google Drive that automatically does charts down here at the bottom. So if you hit this Explore Your Data button, Google will automatically search and see if it can find some sensible information like air temperature, current temperature versus the date it was measured. So you just push this little Insert Chart button, and now you can move this chart to its own sheet, and now you have a good chart that you can edit and publish and use wherever you need. So it lets you change the words and everything, that even the colors and the size. So that way you can visualize your globe data a little better. Here's another chart that I've edited to show you what one looks like if you take some time to change it around a little bit. And then if you need to switch the data columns that it's pulling from, you can just go over here to Chart Types, and you can change which rows it's using as the header and which rows it's using as the for the columns. So right here I have this one is doing my C column, which is just my air temperature measurement, I believe. So once you have your data downloaded, that's basically all you have to do. So we'll go back to the tool and try to do something else. So it lets you do proximity to lakes or schools, or a river. So if we did like, you can type a Lake Superior or something like that, and then you can say how many kilometers away from the lake, and then if you were doing that type of a filter on your data. So this one will let you do the date range. So the data counts are good if you want to not go too crazy with your data counts. If you know that a school has a certain amount of data, or you want to find one that at least has a little bit of data, you can always just change that 0 and bump it up a little bit. And that'll just check whoever you're going through and filter it down. So if you have more than 50 sites listed, everything will be gray and you can't download anything, because that's just too much data to download at once. So make sure you use these site filters to give yourself a smaller range. So if we wanted to do a lat long range, you can just do like -77, and then we'll just do, let's do 33 to 33. I might have got those backwards, yeah, sorry. 39, then we'll just do -70 to -77. Let's see how many schools are in that area. 0, so I must have a wrong thing. So we can choose countries and states. So we could just say United States here. Now you can see all the schools that are in the United States. Still too many. So that's how you would just get this minimized into a better form before you export it. So basically, you just pick a protocol and a location, and then you can download the data. So if anybody has any questions.
Roller Tracy asked, are the schools actually collecting data, or are they just all the schools?
So the list I just showed you was every school that had collected data, because I changed this data count to a 10. So that would show you only schools that have at least 10 data counts.
Can you just demonstrate that piece again?
Mm-hmm. So you can always hit clear filters to start over, and then let's find all the schools that don't have that have at least entered data once. So we'll just say data count, and we'll say 1. Add.
Roller, I don't think you're sharing your screen anymore.
Oh, my bad. Okay. So to clear the filter, you just use this button up here in the left corner, and that will wipe the whole thing clean. And then you can just say data count 1, apply filter, and now you're seeing the list of schools that, the list of sites at the schools that have at least entered data before. And then you can also go in here and just say recent data. So here's the recent data this last year. And then you can even break it down and say that you just wanted to see who's doing air temperature. And now you see all the sites doing air temperature, and it has quite a few sites on here. So it looks like it's taken, okay, here we go, down to the G's. So this is what they were talking about when they said that you can't download right here in the instructions, it says the ability to download data for specific sites within the site list is only available when the number of sites shown is 50 or less. So just when you have so many sites, you just need to keep on figuring out how to bring it down a little bit before you download it. Otherwise, it looks like it would let you download it, but if you go halfway down the page, you notice that it stopped at 50. So now let's see if we can just do Colorado. Oh. See if any of those happen to be Colorado. Nope. Okay. Well, that's one way to narrow it down. I mean, I'm sure Alabama does a lot of data. Let's see. Green. Okay, so this is letting me choose a different site. I was actually looking for the country. Okay. Add a filter, and now we can see there was 58 in the United States, and that's just 8 shy of being able to download it. Now we can do within the proximity of the lake. Okay, anybody within 500 kilometers. There's 4 of them. There we go. And then once that's done, we can download it and see what kind of data we have. It's almost ready. You'll notice in these data export sheets that it gives you the org name, the name of the site, and so that way when you're in the visualization tool, you can go right back to this site and see what it looks like on our globe map. Okay, ready for download. Let's see what's in here. Okay, so this just has org name, the site name, the measurement data, and then we can just make a little chart. So that's how you get the data pulled out of the Globe website and into a different program for viewing. And then if you were looking at visualizing that exact same site, then you might just go to visualize data on this system. And you can hit site right here, and then you can start typing the name of that site. So, and then you'd get all the atmosphere sites. And then you can pick the exact name of it, and it'll bring you directly to it on the map. And then now you can see these data charts and graphs. But so that's how this data is all connected. On that list, when you're downloading, this is how you would select the multiple schools that you'd want to download. So yeah, because it has a checkbox on the left-hand side. So if you just uncheck the ones that you don't want, and then you can download the measurement data for only the schools that you want. Okay.
Roller, you unshared your screen again?
Okay. Well, I didn't have anything else to show.
Okay. Can you just show us where that would be on there? The multiple?
No problem. So right here on the left, so you just check which sites of which schools sites that you want, because they break it down by site. So you'll see there have the field and the outside Mr. Bowen's room and the between the blacktop and the walking track. So if you just wanted shoemate, you just uncheck this guy and then you could download. And if you download summary data, what you're going to get out of this is the site name. You should get the site ID and some. It's not that useful, but it does give you this number, which you can use with the weather stations when they need your site ID. This is the number that they use for the specific site. So outside of Mr. Bowman's room is 34101, and then 34103 is the blacktop. And so this is how you would, when you're doing email data entry, and it usually asks for this. Or if you're doing a weather bug, they'll usually want to know what is the site ID for your site at Globe. Okay.
Does anybody else have any questions? I will take off the listen only if anybody else wants to ask a question.
The conference is no longer in listen-only mode.
So last call before we move on to Jackie. And Roller, are you going to stay on in case people have questions at the end?
Yep, I'll be here.
All right, great. So I'm going to put you back in listen-only mode so that Jackie feels all alone. And I'm going to turn it over to Jackie Wilson, who has been my colleague for years, providing professional development for teachers in New Hampshire with me. And she was at Hubbard Brook, which has collected an immense amount of data forever. And she can tell you a little bit about that as well. But I wanted to have her do this presentation because, again, she deals with an immense amount of data that she helps teachers bring to their students in the classroom and interpret that data. So although it's a high quality, top research forest, she is helping to turn that data, just like we're turning Globe data into usable data for our students. She's been doing that with scientific data that's been collected for years and helping teachers bring that to the classroom too. So she is an expert, and I turn it over to her when it comes to this. So thank you for participating with us, Jackie.
Well, thank you for having me. That was such a nice introduction. But hello, and thank you so much for coming here today. So I'll be talking with you about appropriate graph types and other data visualization skills. And as Jen said, I work at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in Woodstock, New Hampshire. And I know it's going to work. Yes. So, why do we graph things? Why are we trying to represent our data visually? And everything Roller was just showing us with some very large data sets, our brains have a limited ability to take in information and to remember it and process it all at the same time. So we need a little help to understand data sets. And so we graph so we can tell a story and bring meaning to our data. We graph so we can detect patterns. We graph so that we can notice variability. And I will talk more about variability further on in the presentation, but I encourage your students or the people that you are working with who are collecting data to always be aware of variability in their data. Variability is not a bad thing or a good thing. It just is. And it's as important to be aware of any variability as it is of any trends that your data might show. And finally, we graph because it helps us identify questions for further research in the future. And just to illustrate this point, I have to get in one Hubbard Brook data set. We collect samples of stream water weekly, and we analyze those samples for various solutes and pH. And the data set before you is actually showing monthly averages for things like calcium, magnesium, and so on. And in these yellow boxes, I've circled pH, sulfate, and nitrate. So this data from once a month from 1964 until present would be too hard for anybody's brain to wrap their head around in terms of what it's telling us. But if we put it into graphical form, it's a lot easier to see that pH of our stream water and our rainwater has increased over the past 50 years. And acid rain was first discovered in the United States at Hubbard Brook, so people started paying attention to the pH in the early 1960s just when they realized how low it was. The term acid rain actually wasn't coined until afterward. So it was just being able to notice trends in the data. And in the early 1960s, there certainly weren't any trends yet. So the amount of data collected at Hubbard Brook is very big, and so they certainly had to be able to graph it to start to see trends. And sulfate is kind of a byproduct of one of the pollutants that causes acid rain, sulfur dioxide. And so a decline in the concentration of sulfate means that there's been less sulfur dioxide being emitted into the atmosphere by industry. So just a quick example of why we visually represent data. But essentially for most of this webinar, I'll be talking about just a bit about good graphing basics, but we'll spend a good bit of time on basic types of graphs, using the question as your guide in choosing which graph to make, and how you can build good graphing skills in your students or whoever it is that you're working with. So in a nutshell, your graph should always have the following components. The appropriate graph type should be used. The axes should be labeled correctly with units. The title should accurately describe what is being represented. The data should be plotted correctly, and it should contain only what's necessary to the story. Depending on the data set that you have and the level of students that you are working with, you might ask them to include a line of best fit to help notice some trends in the data. So these necessary components should be hammered home every time you ask a student to make a graph. And once your graph has been made, a man named Kaiser Fung recommends that you evaluate the effectiveness of your graph by asking 3 questions, and he calls this the Junk Charts Trifecta checkup. He has a blog called Junk Charts, and if you're interested, check it out. He works with business data, but his knowledge of what makes graphics work is applicable to anybody making graphs. So he says, once you have your visualization, think about what's your practical question, or in our case with globe data, what's the research question? And then what is the chart saying? What's your graph saying? And then finally, what does the data say when you go back and actually look at those hard numbers? Ideally, the answers to all three are the same, or they should be the same. It sounds obvious, but oftentimes this proves to be difficult. Research has shown that the bar graph is the default to which students always go to, or almost always go to, even if a bar graph is not appropriate for the data. So hopefully this webinar will might clear that up for people. So we're going to talk about 8 types of graphs, and you'll see that I've grouped them into categories. Let's take a quick look at how I've grouped them, and then we'll look at an example of each type of graph. So dot plots, box plots, and histograms are good for when you have one group of data and one variable, or perhaps 2 groups of data, 2 kinds of data and 1 variable. I'll return more detail to this idea of 1 or 2 groups and 1 or 2 variables later on in the presentation. Bar graphs are good for comparing single numbers that summarize a group. Pie charts and stacked bar graphs are good for when you have a group of subgroups, or you're looking at parts of a whole, a proportion of a whole, with just 1 variable. And finally, line graphs and scatter plots are good for when you have one group with 2 variables, or sometimes you might plot more than 1 group on a single graph. So to jump right into dot plots, box plots, and histograms, I'm going to use a data set that comes from Hubbard Brook, which, by the way, it's an experimental forest owned and operated by the United States Forest Service. So they have lots of temperature data. We're going to be looking at June 2011, the daily average temperatures. And if I wanted to know how often did each daily average temperature occur, I would use a box plot or a dot plot or a histogram. And how I would start is I would take my data and I would start to write it down. So I have 22, 12, 12, 13, and I would write it down just like that. And then I would start to order that data from the lowest temperature to the greatest temperature. And when I went through my list and I found that 10 was the lowest temperature, I wrote it down and I crossed it off to make sure I didn't get confused. And just a way of keeping track of things. And each time I wrote down every number. So you'll see I wrote down 5 12s. And I'm able to take that information and put that into a frequency table. So there's only one day in which the temperature was 10 degrees. 0 days that it was 11 degrees, 5 days that it was 12 degrees, and so on. So what can we do with this data? Well, if you put it in a dot plot is a way to visually look at a frequency table. Every single dot is a data point from that table, and it lets you ask questions like, what was the most frequent temperature? Because you can just look at where the highest stacks of dots are. So we see that 19 degrees Celsius was the most frequent temperature. Whoops. It also lets us look at the range of temperatures. And as you might already know, range is when we subtract the smallest value from the highest value. So our range of temperatures here is 14. A dot plot is great for noticing outliers. We don't really have any outliers in this data, but if we did have a day in June where the temperature was 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, it would be very easy to see. You can also, if you wanted to, it would be possible to calculate the mean and the median from this data because you can access each specific data point. You can look at the shape of the data. Is your data set skewed, or is it symmetric? Is it bell shaped? Is it flat? And in the lower grades, I saw we have some teachers of lower, or people that work with lower grade levels. On this webinar, I often see dot plots used in the younger grades for good reason. But if you are a high school teacher, dot plots can also be useful because if you're planning on using statistics with your students, It's necessary to know whether the data are normally distributed, if they have a bell shape, in order to know what type of statistics to use. So dot plots are pretty cool. But let's contrast a dot plot with the box and whisker plot. I like box and whisker plots. They're so interesting. So a box and whisker plot graphically represents the 5 most important descriptive values for a data set. And these values include the minimum value, the first quartile, the median value, the third quartile, and then the maximum value. And when graphing this 5-number summary, only the horizontal axis displays values. There's no y-axis. And a vertical line is placed above each of those summary numbers. And then a box is drawn around those middle 3 lines, being this is called the first quartile, the median, and the third quartile. And then we have these lines that extend out to the maximum and the minimum points. Those are our whiskers. So a box plot does not allow us to see individual data points like the dot plot did. Instead, it allows us to quickly see the median and the range of our data. So the median being the middle number. So if I go back to my little scratch pad, I had 30 different days of data. And so the middle was 30 between day 15 and day 16. That's 17.5. That's how I calculated the median. So you can easily see that here. And you can also look at the range and also the spread of data. I mean, we had 25% of the days with temperatures between 13 and 17.5, but then we had 25% of our days with the temperatures between 17.5 and 19. So again, looking at variability, and I really feel like no matter what age level of the participants, all investigations should consider variability in the data collected. So finally, let's take the same data set and look at the histogram. Histogram is not the same thing as a bar graph. So a histogram is summarizing data by putting it into categories or like bins. So here we can see we had 6 days where the temperatures were between 10 and 12 degrees, 5 days when the temperatures were between 13 and 15 degrees. There are no spaces between these columns of data because the data is one continuous range from 12 degrees Celsius up to 24. So there's no white space between like there is in a bar graph. A histogram is not good when you need to reference specific values. Like you could not calculate the mean from this. But it is good when wide variances exist among the observed frequencies for a particular data set. So if there were 2 or more categories with high frequencies or high columns, a box plot wouldn't be great because had this data simply been graphed using a box plot, values might average one another out, which would cause the distribution to look roughly normal. So a histogram can be useful in highlighting variance in data. So we are going to move on to another type of graph, and we're not going to use the same data set, but we will stick with the theme of temperature. So let's talk about the bar graph. I want to talk about bar graphs next because they are often confused with histograms. But you see here, we are dealing with different categories of data. We have open grass, under the bushes, and blacktop. So there is a white space between our bars because these things are not connected. Those categories are not connected. Our question being, what's the temperature of different surfaces around the school? Easy to see, blacktop's the clear winner. There's average temperature of 17 degrees. The bar graph can be wonderful. If you have older students or just more advanced students, you might want to ask them to show error bars on their bar graph, again, to indicate how much variability there might be. Let's move on to pie charts. Pie charts. Everybody loves pie charts, and they are really great in describing things. If we simply wanted to describe what we found in our vernal pool in April, what kinds of macroinvertebrates are present in a vernal pool in April, Well, as you see, we had 151 copepods and 72 water fleas, 122 fairy shrimp. We could also represent this same pie graph but by using percentages. So very good for descriptive types of questions. If you want to compare parts of a whole for two or more groups, a stacked bar graph would be useful. So if you were asking what kinds of macroinvertebrates are present in a vernal pool in April as compared to in June, stacked bar graph does that nicely. So here, this one is showing us the number of individuals collected. The y-axis, is showing the number of individuals collected, and here the y-axis, the graph on the right is showing the percent of individuals collected. So two pretty different ways to visualize the data. Now whether to show the straight up values, the numbers of individuals found, or whether to show the percentages depends on the question being asked, right? If we're asking about the composition of communities, we probably use the graph on the right, which shows percentages, but if we were asking about total numbers of individuals found, we'd choose the graph on the left. Okay, we have two more graphs to cover. The line graph. I love the line graph. It shows us change over time. So here we have many years of data from Hubbard Brook, 50 years of data looking at snow depth. And we drew a line of best fit here. And as you can see, we have tons of variability. And that's very common in environmental data and ecosystem data. But we draw a line of best fit just to see if there's a trend. And indeed, it looks to me like there's a downward trend. But honestly, the scientists at Hubbard Brook have run statistics on this, and they have found that the snowpack has declined significantly, statistically significantly, by 25 centimeters over the past 50 years. So if you are teaching probably middle school level, I think getting students to draw a line of best fit is very instructive. If you're at the high school level or beyond, usually when we draw these lines, we include values like the coefficient of determination, the R-squared value, to indicate how well does this line actually represent the data. And as you can see, most of the data points do not fall along the line. So the line isn't super accurately representing the data. If we were going to try and use this line to predict the snowpack in 2015, we probably wouldn't have a lot of confidence that this line would nail it right on. But it is useful for us in looking at the trends. But again, scientists always make sure they quantify how well the line is really describing the data by using statistics. And I won't talk more about statistics here unless you have questions. The last graph I want to show you, actually no, before I move on to the last graph, I want to return to this data set, the location around different areas of the school and the average temperature at each of those locations. So remember this in the bar graph. Well, it was great for comparing averages, but let's look at the same data set with a line graph. Look at that. Look at that variation. So, in the bar graph, the black top was the clear winner. But when we look at it as a line graph with each of the 4 trials for each location plotted, we see that the black top has a lot of variability. Maybe trial 1 and trial 2 are outliers, or maybe trial 3 and trial 4 are outliers. Maybe we should go out and collect some more data just to check things out. So just two different ways of looking at one data set. And now I'll move on to our last graph, the scatter plot. Scatter plot is such a neat graph, and it's useful for looking at the relationship between two variables. And we'll talk about the independent variable and the dependent variable here. As an independent variable changes, what happens to the dependent variable? So our question here is, what is the relationship between spring temperatures and the timing of bud burst? And I know a lot of globe schools look at different phenological measurements, so you might find this useful. Maybe you'll end up making a graph similar to this. let me show you this graph that comes from Hubbard Brook, and I want to explain it a little bit because it's pretty interesting. The x-axis has thermal sum or growing degree days on that. And what that is the thermal sum is the sum of all the degrees over 5 degrees C that accumulated between March 1st and May 31st of that year. So let's say it's March 1st and it's 6 degrees Celsius. We give that day a score of 1 because 6 degrees Celsius is 1 more than 5. Let's say at March 2nd, it's 8 degrees Celsius. March 2nd gets a score of 3 because 8 degrees is 3 higher than 5. We would add March 1st and 2nd together, 1 plus 3, and we have a total growing degree day index of 4. So they did that for all the days between March 1st and May 31st of that year. And what they saw was that when the thermal sum was high, the buds burst, the leaves started to grow around Julian Day 115, which is April 26th. And when our thermal sum was a lot lower, when temperatures were cooler, the date of bud burst occurred later, Julian Day 145, which was May 25th. Oh my goodness, it looks to me, I'm sorry, give me 1 second. I was just kicked offline. At least it appears to me I was kicked offline. Okay, reconnecting. Okay. 1 second. Now you can see how many slides I have. Okay. So, essentially, warmer springs make date of bud. Well, I just made a big mistake. I started to say one thing caused another. When we use scatter plots, we have to be really careful because we are just showing how two variables are correlated, how two variables are related, but we cannot say that the independent variable is definitely causing the dependent variable. Now, you'd have to devise further experiments to get at the question of what is causing what. And often in ecology, it's not very cut and dry what is causing what. But research on this has been done all around the world. And in our part of the world, where our soils are pretty wet all the time, we don't have a wet and dry season, we can comfortably say that we believe that it is the thermal sum that drives bud burst every year. But if you only had this graph to go by, you couldn't say that thermal sum was causing the date of bud burst. So I just wanted to make that clear. If you and your students use scatter plots, be careful they don't think it's causation, and be clear that you're just looking at correlation. Okay, so now we're going to move on. Those are our 8 graphs. We're going to move on to using your research question as your guide for deciding what kind of graph to make. And the idea of using a question as your guide was developed into a fantastic resource called the Graph Choice Chart. And if you just simply Google the Graph Choice Chart, the first thing that comes up will be a PDF of what I'm about to show you. It was developed by the Maine Data Literacy Project in partnership between the Schoodic Institute and the University of Maine. It's written about in the NSTA Science Teacher Journal, 2014. But this is the Graph Choice Chart. It's so neat. It's being led to your graph type based on your question. And I just want to take a couple minutes to go through this question or box by box so that when we're done with the webinar, maybe you'll already feel comfortable using it and you'll start using it right away with your students. So the first question, it's kind of like a dichotomous key. So maybe your question asks about variability within a group of data or data points. So I have my 2 example questions. How variable are the wind speeds in our schoolyard? What's the range of temperatures in June? And we've been through this already with Dotplot, Boxplot, and Histogram. Does your question compare 2 or more groups to decide if they're the same or different? So Now we have to dig down a little and think about this a little more. Well, do you want to compare the variability of all the data points in each group? Like, which of these two locations is most consistently the snowiest? Or are you comparing single numbers that summarize a group, such as the mean, like where our temperature is greatest in our schoolyard? How does average snowfall for Sweden and Canada compare? So if you're going to compare variability, again, you would choose Dotplot, Boxplot, or Histogram. But if you're comparing single numbers that summarize a group, you use a bar graph. Isn't it just great how this question is leading us right to the graph? Does your question ask if two numeric factors are correlated? Does it ask about how something changes through linear time? Yes, if it does, and here's an example question: how has snow depth changed over the last 50 years? How have temperatures changed over the last 3 months? Or, if the answer is no, and example questions are, is the temperature of an area related to latitude? Or, how are temperature and bud burst related? That's another branching point on the graph choice chart. So if something is changing through linear time, we go to a line graph. If it's not changing through linear time and we're just trying to look at the relationship between two variables, we use a scatter plot. Does your question ask how a total is proportioned into subgroups, or what proportion a subgroup is of a total? Like what kinds of macroinvertebrates are present in April, or maybe what are the ratios of sand, silt, and clay in this soil sample? We have our pie chart and our stacked bar graph. And again, our pie chart is good for parts of the whole, just describing what's in one area. And our stacked bar chart is good for comparing two different moments in time, maybe two different levels. So again, here's the graph choice chart, and I strongly encourage you to Google it and check it out, and hopefully use it with your students. So my last part, I'll take a couple minutes, how you can build skills in students. And when I say students, I know some of you are informal educators. Even with adults, we can all use help learning graphs. So I would always hammer home the necessary graph components if you're making graphs. I would always focus on the research question and give them the graph choice chart. You could show examples of excellent visualizations. And there's two that I write down here. I know Jen is going to post this to the web later so you can go back and look at this. But I would Google the history of atmospheric carbon dioxide. It's this really neat short video. I think it's 3.5 minutes. And it's showing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere for the last 800,000 years until 2014. And it happens in like 3 minutes and 45 seconds or something. It's an amazing amount of data in a short time. And another excellent visualization to show people is Hans Rosling, The Joy of Stats. He made a video that, he made a visualization that looks at the average life expectancy versus the average life expectancy of people versus the wealth of the country that person is from over time. And his visualization starts in the year 1810 and goes up to the present. And he says he had to crunch 100,000 numbers to make the visualization. But in just 4 minutes, it's very eloquently done, and it's very powerful. People can learn a lot from watching that. So inspire your students by showing them excellent visualizations. Last but not least, quiz them on appropriate graph types. These examples are taken from the journal Science and Children, another NSCA journal for elementary teachers. So for example, this comes right from that article. You could, Galen, Martha, Sabrina, and Wally work on their homework different amounts of time each week. And Galen averages 10 hours per week. Martha averages 5 hours per week. Sabrina averages 3 hours per week, and Wally averages 1 hour per week. What's the best way to represent this data? in a line graph or in a bar graph? I'm sure that you know it's the bar graph, but it's interesting to talk about. If someone were to pick the line graph, what is that showing? Is it showing that if your name comes earlier in the alphabet, that you work more on your homework per week? Drawing that line like that is connecting those people in a way that is misrepresenting the data. I know we're almost out of time. I'm going to skip this example, but it's another just quiz example. But I do want to show you this one last one because it talks about histograms and scatter plots. So a study was done comparing the average annual income of 50-year-old adults and the number of years of their formal education. Here is that data graphed as a histogram. Again, our data is in categories. And it makes it look like if you only have 0 to 5 years of formal education, you don't make as much money as someone that's had 25 to 30 years of education. Well, if we graph that as a scatter plot, we get a different story, don't we? So here, the scatter plot is revealing that while there is a correlation between the annual income and education, it's not a super strong correlation. You could have gone to school for years and years and still not making much money, or you could have gone to school for a relatively smaller amount of time and be making more money. So just some skills that you can work on with your students. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for bearing with me through all my technical difficulties. Jen, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Jackie. So we're right at the end, and I just wanted to just make sure that we looked briefly at all of the rubrics. So these are the rubrics. I know we're right at 5 o'clock, a little bit after. So thank you for sticking around. But these are the data analysis rubrics for each of the science fair portions on the data summary. So we have the 3 through 5, the 6 through 8. You'll see that there's 2 rows now, and then we have the 9 through 12. And along with Jackie's resources, when I do publish this and put it on the website, I'm also going to be including some of the other resources that are already on the GLOBE website having to do with data analysis. So that'll be the steps in the scientific process, other webinars that have been given on this. There's one on retrieving and visualizing your data, and also the links to the data access tool and visualizing the data, which has the link to the visualizations page and to tutorials about that. So I'm going to open it up. If anybody, I realize it's a little after 5, so if you wanted to take off, that's fine. But if anybody had questions for Jackie or myself or Roller, we will stay on the line for a few more minutes.
The conference is no longer in listen-only mode.
So if anybody has any questions, now would be a good time.
Jen, this is Svetlana speaking. This was an amazing presentation, super rich, and I would love to, it looked like there was new instructions for visualization on the website, and before Roller takes off and also Jackie, are there sort of more, are there step-by-step instructions that we can download? There was at one time in the previous version of the visualization materials download for our teachers to walk through some of this with them if needed.
Yeah, in the visualization one, right below the Enter Visualization System, there's the PDF and that
There's a
walks.
PDF version. Okay.
Yeah, and a PowerPoint, and it'll walk you through exactly what to do, and then it even has examples at the bottom of things that you can have them try and do, data that you think that they might want to collect.
And we have an activity as well on finding data and looking at data. So I'll make sure that those links are to those as well if you wanted to practice those skills.
Perfect.
Are there any more questions before everyone exits? Oh, wait a minute.
This is Tracy out in California. I just wanted to do a shout out for both Roller and Jackie. I found both presentations really, really helpful, and I always love it when I can learn something and pass it along. So just a personal thanks.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And David asked about weather data in the New York City area. And I know that when I talked to Roller about this presentation, he had mentioned that they do have a list of schools that have collected data that are good starting points for that. So David, we can talk about that, and I can try and get you that. Roller, could you take note of that too, so in case so we can confer on that as well?
Yep.
All right. Well, then I'm going to let everybody go because it is 5:07 my time. And thank you very much for coming. And this will be posted relatively quickly onto the Globe website along with links to all of these other resources that we have available to us and the ones that Jackie shared with us.
Perfect.
Okay, everybody. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.